Greetings and welcome to the Progressive Christians podcast. We are the love your neighbor kind of Christians and not the storm in the Capitol kind. So if you're curious about what a socially and politically progressive Christianity looks like, then this is the podcast for you. My name is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter and I'm your host. I'm a professor of theology at Methodist Theological School in Ohio, and I'm the lead pastor of the Loft Faith Community in Los Angeles, California. If you like the show, please rate, review, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. We definitely appreciate all the likes, the comments, the reviews. It helps people find us on either Spotify or iTunes especially. And if you're on YouTube, please click like and subscribe, leave some comments. We are always interacting with the comments. I am delighted to be joined by the full crew, plus one, which is basically still the full crew because Everest has been on so many times. So yeah, how are y'all doing?
Hello. I'm doing good.
Hi.
Doing good.
It's the first time it's all five of us, so
It
we're
is.
like, it is.
Yay.
I know we this is the, what did we say earlier? Well, I said Super Friends, but we'll just say the
It's
Avengers.
the Super Friends.
I said
Yeah.
True Plus.
Yeah, or that, either way it goes. Either way it
Super
goes.
Friends,
Either way it
which
goes.
apparently allegedly is a comic book reference.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you got it. Yep,
You
100%.
did get it. You did get it. You did
Absolute
get it.
nerd over there.
A couple of shout outs I want to get to before we get to the primary topic of today's episode. And this is just in referencing to what we discussed last week. The entire podcast was about the way in which the public image of Christianity is not great, broadly speaking, and continuing to decline. And Bradley Sharp had a really good comment on our Spotify. He wrote, "Our country has forgotten just how violent our foundations are. As a Christian, even or perhaps especially as a progressive Christian, I suppose we have to do the repentant work of remembering that it was the Christians who held humans in slavery. It was the Christians who worked toward the genocide of indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere. It was the Christians who created the KKK. I want to say not all Christians, but to some, it is all Christians, and we are not safe for some." And I think those last few words, the fact that we are not safe for some, really resonated with a lot of how I know people feel, particularly how I know indigenous communities have felt, given the fact that technically it's still legal. Like the doctrine of discovery, like, is still legal. It is still used. The last Supreme Court justice to use it was RBG, which, I'm like, that's just the truth, right? So we have to recognize that this is a doctrine deeply informed by Christianity and Christian thought. The fact that a pope in Italy can be like, yeah, you can go over there and get some land and just say it's yours and discover it. So anyway, Bradley, thank you for that comment. And Ben followed up with a comment that basically, that I thought really encapsulated the aim of the episode, and that even though we've made these mistakes as Christians and there's repair work and repentance to do, ultimately we are dependent upon God's grace, forgiveness, and knowing that God is still God and at work and still speaking in the world. And that is our aim and goal. And so understanding that we can move forward, knowing that we, as long as we are trying and doing the work that God's called us to do, the repair is still possible. So thank you both for your comments. This week's episode, we will be discussing gender roles in traditional marriage. So we're kind of going through one might say, deconstructing gender roles in traditional marriage. And this kind of came up because of the question that Garrett actually sent us last week. We ended talking about this, and we felt like we had been thinking about doing a podcast about trad wives and other kinds of stuff, and it kind of made sense for us to continue talking because we realized there's a lot more we wanted to say about this episode. I'm really excited because there is just a lot of stuff that I'm going to learn in this episode. So these are always my favorites. So I wanted to start by framing this conversation around the idea of what traditional or biblical marriage is, like what it really meant, not what we imagine it to have meant. And to do this, I'm really building on the work of, or I'm in conversation with the work of Margaret Farley, who is a Roman Catholic nun, and her book Just Love. And what's fascinating about Farley is, I would say Farley is, you would say, either at the progressive end of moderate or at the moderate end of progressive, right? She is Catholic and wants to not get excommunicated by the Catholic Church. And so there's this tension that she's wrestling with, and honestly has a deep reverence and respect for tradition while also recognizing that tradition has done harm. I love the text. It's an amazing text. I think it actually is pretty much in alignment with my own thinking around it. But I know that I tend to be on the more, again, moderate end of progressivism when you're talking about relationships and gender. And this is where I think our conversation today is really going to reveal some differences that we have. If we get to the ways in which we are thinking about traditional marriage, quote unquote, when people are talking about it or talking about the concept or idea of biblical marriage, we have to recognize that, quite honestly, polygamy has been the marriage institute of choice across more time and more cultures than any other, up to and including Christianity, because marriage was understood as a economic practice up until roughly the 1700s. It was fundamentally not about love, and it was more about what is needed to provide for an institution as the family, or the family as an institution. And so in this sense, it was deeply patriarchal, right? So there's a role that the state plays in shaping gender roles and what genders ought and ought not do based on what role you're playing. And so you have this idea that emerges within a Western framework of traditional gender roles to mean as men are head of household or paterfamilias, and women are lost in that particular set of identity within a Western patriarchal paterfamilias framework. And that becomes inherited within the Christian tradition, but it's not deeply Jewish, right? It just becomes a part of when the church becomes a Roman Catholic. This is a part of the inheritance, one might say. But with respect to early Christianity, I'll say this, and then I want to pause. I would say, you're talking about like 100s, 200s, probably even into early 300s. There was resistance to marriage, a rejection of family ties, because we have to remember when you read Paul, it's obvious. Paul, they are writing because they believe Christ's return is imminent. So they're just like, you know what? We don't need to worry about marriage. We don't really need to be that concerned about family. Like Jesus is, God is coming back. Like we about at the end, so it's not that deep. We need to focus on doing the work of evangelizing, if you will. And then you see this shift where there's also a place where you see the church as a substitute for traditional families. And I think in Julia, for me, this reminds me of what we begin to see in the Book of Longings, right? You really begin to see, like, even though they're not, it's the early church, right? Because literally the book is like around, about Jesus. Um, well, it's really about Jesus's, if Jesus had a wife. I shouldn't say it's about Jesus, because ironically, Jesus is a secondary character. Um, but you see those communities that are being formed, and relationships, communities, families, all these things, our marriage is a part of it, but it's a part, not the central part. It's much more about what constitutes a family, and a marriage is a part of that broader structure of family. And so in this sense, marriage is understood as a good, a way to help us to be unselfish, a way to practice unselfish love, but a part of a larger structure of practicing unselfish love, right? It's not just within the confines of marriage that we are able to practice this. It's within the confines of the family as such, right? And the family was the extended family. It wasn't just like your immediate, what we might call a nuclear family, which is, again, is a very normative early concept. And so I just want to stop and pause here to see if I have any thoughts or comments or reflections on that before I just, talk a little bit about the way this stuff shifts in the 1700s with Christianity.
Well, I'm really glad you brought up the Book of Longings, and something that Suman Kidd wrote in the afterword for that book was kind of that marriage was so expected that, her argument was that if Jesus had not been married, it probably would have been mentioned. But if he was, it was such a default. And so I think hearing you say that marriage was kind of not even about the couple, but more about the family structures, that makes a lot of sense to me, because I'm like, okay, so people were just existing a lot more communally. And so it was really necessary to be a part of a family more, like beyond just it's really important to be married.
100%. And I think, and Julia, this is, your recommendation to even read that book. Like, it added a fictional story deepened my academic understanding of
It
early.
humanizes.
Yeah. Yeah. I was like, oh wow, this author did so much research. It adds more depth to what I imagine, early Christian family structures look like.
I also, the irony is not lost on me that Paul wrote about, don't even bother, don't worry about it because the end is near. So we need to be focused on other things. And yet today, the same Christians who are actively trying to bring about the end are like, the most important thing we can do is have families. It's like, it reminds me that they're conflating their politics and their religion. Again, like that it's not about what they say it's about. It's about something more nefarious, in my personal judgmental opinion.
Your judgment. I was say, well, maybe you could say judgmental. I don't know. I was gonna say judgment. Trying to say
judgmental opinion.
She said what she said.
I said what I said. Judgmental. It's about their notion of. I mean, ultimately, it's their idea of great replacement theory. They're not using those words, but that's what it is. They want to make sure they're making enough babies because they're worried about there being too many more brown people.
And they're not worried about Christ returning.
No, not really in the way in which Paul is writing about it. So yeah, that's an excellent connection. Wesley, Blair, anything that come up for y'all in that?
Well, so one of the things that came up for me was I think we're also addressing a listener question later on. And as part of that reading, you sent us Queer Theology by Lynn Marie Tonstad. And one of the things that in reading the portion that you sent over, the author articulates that like heterosexual monogamous marriage was an accommodation to human weakness. And so like even as we consider and think about traditional ancient versions of marriage, it's not there's a variety of ways in which early Christians or early people were thinking about it. So it just lends itself to being like there isn't a traditional singular version of marriage. People were doing marriage for a variety of reasons.
100%. And I think the idea that there is a single tradition is the problem, right? It's like that is the problem. Recognize it's always been a plurality. And when you say things like a traditional, it limits the reality of human experience and Christian experience.
There's this old video, and I'll have to find it. It's like a YouTube classic now, of this like woman explaining what biblical marriage is. And she's like, oh, it's supposed to be between one man and one woman. But let's actually look at the Bible, because it starts out between one man and one woman. And then the next generation, it's one man with two women. And then the next generation, it's one man and two women and a pack of women. And then the next generation, it's one man and five women, five wives, and a pack of concubines. Like, and so she like runs through all of the patriarchs' marriages in the Old Testament. And she's like, so what is biblical marriage? Because, the economic realities meant that that's what's expressed in the Bible. And then, as you said, even in the New Testament, it's like the provision to say one man and one woman is like, don't take on more than you can chew. Like, don't have three wives and a pack of concubines if you can't support them all. So it's all tied to economics. And like, there are aspects that talk about love and affection and care and mutual respect. That's all in the Bible too. But this idea of like one man and one woman, the reason that's in there is an economic reason. So.
And even then, I mean, it's actually, and this is where I think Farley's helpful. There's not a lot about love and care and mutual respect in the Bible. Like, that's stuff we put on it. Like, we put on it with respect to marriage. Like, it's in there with respect to other people, but specifically with respect to marriage, it's about economics. And I think that's what when I taught my class on Christian social ethics and I did my section on marriage and family, that's what I wanted the students to understand, is for those people who say they believe in something that's called traditional marriage, at its core, it's always been within the confines of what we're calling the Bible and tradition. It's been an economic transaction. It's been, if you have a daughter, now I have this daughter I can sell to provide for my family. That's what it was, because it's the only way their daughter can earn enough money to provide for the family, right? And to be fair, I think, and I want to skip to the end again, but I do think, like, I wish some people who believe that marriage is about economics actually said that's what they believe. That it's, when they're talking about tradition, I do think they're talking about it should be about an economic transaction, and I'm paying for this, and you should do this stuff because I'm paying for it. If they were honest, at least we could have an honest conversation. But they try to hide it around, purity culture and, I want to support this person. They don't have to work and women shouldn't be doing this. I'm like, I don't know if that's what you really, really actually think. But let me wrap this section up by saying, so we can get to more unpacking this with respect to the role race plays, especially. We see in the 1700s there's this shift that happens in part. It's a consequence of the Protestant Reformation, where you start having clergy that can get married, and so therefore the idea that you are technically married to the church is gone. The idea that your commitment to God is only made manifest if you are tied and yoked to God as a priest or a nun is theologically challenged. And so in this sense, sex couldn't be justified, so to speak, but it could be forgiven in the context of marriage. That's what you see this shift. And that's what Farley writes. And that's what a few other people who've written about this period basically say, that sex moves to it's similar to what you said, Wesley, about like this compromise. Like we have to have, okay, we know people are going to have sex. So we need to have this framework of marriage, so where it's controlled and a way in which you can demonstrate a particular kind of holiness and service. And what this does with respect to gender roles, Farley writes, and Stephanie Kuntz is another person who's written a lot about this, is it, because of this model, it places women, white women, I should say, because I know, Julia, you're going to get this, with very few alternatives other than the role of wife and mother. But this had not always been the case. This is a very recent phenomenon within the context of the way we talk about this history. And so I think keeping that in mind should give us a bit of pause when we're talking about like traditional marriage and what that means and what that actually looks like. So I know one of the ways we want to challenge some of these common interpretations in gender roles is looking specific at the role race and class have played, well, and even sexual identity, like how that's played in creating these cultural norms. And so I know there are a couple things we want to discuss in this section, but Julia, I want to toss it to you first. What ways in which do you think we ought to begin unpacking this with respect to how those norms came to be in place, and what some of those norms actually are? What assumptions are they making, one might say, that perhaps other people may not be aware of or picking up on?
Whiteness, Western traditional values as mainstream culture have made it very easy for white Americans to conflate their cultural values with their Christian values and also with their political values. Those things are very, very different. And so when people talk about traditional marriage and they think about Mad Men, which is always really funny to me because people yearn for this, Make America Great Again. They want it to be like Mad Men. But that's what we yearn for. We want to go back to that. Okay, fine. Where it's like the husband goes into the city to work and leaves the wife in the suburbs at the house with the kids and the dog, and that is somehow upheld as traditional marriage, that women should stay home while men work, when that only ever happened for a brief period of time for a very specific segment of the population. Like that only happened after World War II until almost 1960. And it only happened for white Americans because of the GI, because of the amount of money that the government injected very specifically and directly into white communities. And the only reason they were able to do that was because they didn't do it in other communities. In some places, it was against the law for Black women not to have a job and be working in domestic service for white people. So the idea that is a traditional marriage that everyone should be pursuing is not religious, that's cultural. And I'm not even saying that it's bad to want that if that's your culture, but like to say that is somehow holier and to pretend as though that's been the reality for all of American cultures is just not true.
Even the women who were quote unquote kept women, who are at quote unquote at home taking care of the children in that era that you described, Julia, they weren't raising their own kids. Black women were raising their kids. Hispanic women were raising their kids. Asian immigrant women were raising their kids. Those moms had nannies and housekeepers. So it's just a manifestation of prosperity, and prosperity concentrated in this particular cultural experience by race.
One thing I want to say really quickly is this is what shocked me when my grandmother passed away, was how I wasn't fully aware of how many children she helped raise in the town she lived in. And I'm telling you, the funeral had it was probably about 600 people, like my grandma, because she was a nanny to so many of these white people. I would say a quarter of the funeral was white people that I did not know. And they were like, oh, your grandmother, she babysat me, or she did this, or and I was just like, holy crap, because that was her job. That was her job. It was crazy. Wesley?
Wesley, before you go, I know it's easy. You say your grandmother. For the record, my mother was a domestic when she grew up in Kentucky. So like, to remind everyone that this was near, like, this isn't, I'm the first generation in my family to be born outside of segregation.
What I was going to say is, it's wild because what people are articulating, what white folk are articulating when they want to go back to this time of Mad Men and single household incomes and women staying at the home, they're saying it's traditional marriage, but I think what they're failing to realize is this is government investment in people. This is a government that cares to make sure
Subsidies.
that people
Subsidies.
have subsidies for the things that they need to survive. And so this government can still do that for everybody. Instead of tax breaks for billionaires, we could fund housing. We could voucher. Like, there's so much the same way that the GI Bill helped build the middle class, the federal government could do the same thing in 2025 and make it possible for humanity in the United States to thrive in a way that it used to.
To summarize, quote unquote, traditional marriage requires welfare.
I'm so glad we did that podcast on economics. I'm gonna have to put it in the show notes again, because whenever we talk about it, people are like, "Where is it at?" Because I'm like, man, that Matthew Desmond book, that just explains a lot. You're right. It is about investment.
In the backlash, and I know that's what we're going to go to next, like the backlash of the sort of like contemporary conservative women calling for this return to quote unquote traditional femininity and traditional marriage, it's happening because of a malaise related to economics. It's that we were told we could have it all as women, and we fought like heck to get rights and the ability to have a career and make our own money and have our own bank accounts and hold property in our own name. I mean, I was shocked to learn that when my mother started college, she couldn't have a bank account by herself. Like, that's recent history, right? And so we fought like heck to have access to be independent economic entities. But what we didn't do when we gained that economic access was overturn the economic structure that required one part of a family to stay at home and do the domestic labor that is required for a household to run. And we also didn't remove the patriarchal expectation that it is the female partner in a heterosexual partnership that is the one who is supposed to manage those domestic tasks. And so all we did was create this unbelievable burden on women in the workforce to both bring in an income and manage their own household, which many, 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 many women have done for generations, as we pointed out, right? But the economic structure was such that women, or whoever was the household partner, didn't have to bring in as much financially. And so there was this balance between keeping the home and continuing to bring in income. But then we opened up the economic opportunities to women, and we didn't subsidize the economic requirements of the home. And so we just placed this unbelievable emotional and time and economic burden on women who are in the workforce. So then these young girls are like, I don't want to have a full-time job and be a full-time mom and have a partner who doesn't pull their weight. And I like, this is stupid. I don't want to do it. So I want to go back, quote unquote, back to this imagined economic period where I could just be a kept person. And again, the reality of like the only people that happened for were in all of history, were incredibly rich people or incredibly subsidized people.
And I think, there's a couple things I'm going to say, and Everest, actually have a question I want to ask you that isn't in the rundown, so I apologize, but just came up for me. First of all, I want us to be very clear for those who are listening. Please understand, for Black and brown people, when you talk about traditional marriage, it sounds stupid. It just literally, we're like, okay, our people have literally
It's never looked like that.
We were women were working in the fields with their babies, right? Picking cotton. It's like you have to wrestle with that. You can't on one hand say this is what I want as tradition without recognizing the reason you're able to have that tradition is because you had enslaved people. And so you have to wrestle with that to say, well, is this actually supposed to be part of the tradition if it required enslavement of human beings? Perhaps not, right? Like you have to do that interior work. And I'm sorry, I get frustrated because I am reminded of my grandmother, I am reminded of my grandparents and of my ancestors who had to always work. Like, my mom literally worked 3 jobs, I always say, so we could afford to be poor. Like, that was our experience growing up. And so it bothers me in that particular way. So I make sure we name that. And when I talk about a progressive vision, when we get to the end, I do think there's things in the text, in the Bible, we can pull from and learn from, but it's not, I believe, what we have prioritized with respect to this notion of individualism. Everest, I know you had something you wanted to share.
Thank you. I was like, if he asks me a question right now, I'm gonna either forget what I was gonna say or forget the question. Anyway, I was thinking about how in the last few years there's been this like big resurgence of the cowboy aesthetic. Okay, and stay with me. And I had this really interesting conversation with Queer Group a few weeks ago about how like we have a theory that the like cowboy resurgence is also coming from a place of longing for like something simpler and kind of for like a reconnection with the land. And I think reading some of the articles we were looking at this week about the trad wife movement, and again, like just even thinking about traditional marriage, white traditional marriage as a concept, I was thinking about like the horseshoe of kind of this larger system feels really unfulfilling and exhausting and hard for everyone. And I think that longing to like be a part of a community and have a family and get to really pour into the people you love and connect with the land that you're on and like live in that way makes a lot of sense to me as well, and makes sense to the people around me that are working their butts off and are so tired and are so broke and are living in this city where they feel really disconnected from earth and each other. And I think that the reason that the trad wife lifestyle is so privileged is because those people have someone to bankroll them, but like the actual base longing makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that is why this conversation is really interesting, because I see this horseshoe of like a lot of young people on all parts of the political spectrum feeling really exhausted and seeing that something is not working. And the logic around what we should do with that is different, or I guess the reasons for what we should do with that are different, but I feel like the direction is similar. And so that really feels strange, because I will hear their arguments and be like, I actually almost agree with you, but for different reasons.
I think we're all feeling the reality of what's happening, and progressives are blaming a system. Hopefully, I hope most progressives are blaming a system, and perhaps more conservatives, and I'm even talking about religious, I'm talking about political here, are blaming individuals. This is why you see this pushback against like immigrants and things of that nature. Like they're like, oh, that's why I can't have the stuff I want, because they're taking the jobs, they're taking the houses, they're taking the. I'm like, actually, it's the billionaires, right? Like you're blaming the wrong things. But I think we all are actually feeling it, and I think Everest, you're correct. There is a longing for something simpler because we know that what we're doing right now isn't working. And so the trad wife movement, and Julia, so I want to toss it to you so we can begin to unpack this. Like to talk about this, the way these assumptions and norms are have been created. Like, or I guess one might say the propaganda, if you will. Like actually, I would actually read exactly what you wrote because I thought it was so good. How mainstream and conservative propaganda is pushing a very specific image of white femininity onto the public. And I do think this is a part of that, maintaining the system as such for them so the people at the top can continue to benefit if they use that particular kind of propaganda to make it look like it's better than what it actually is. So yeah, so Julia, how do you see this notion of like the branding of white femininity, the trad wife movement and all these things? How do you see this being tied together to uphold some of these systems that we know are broken?
So, first, I want to say I actually agree very deeply with whatever said. I too have had this yearning, right? And I wouldn't call it for a simpler time, because especially after rereading that Ballerina Farms article, ain't nothing simple about having a farm. Like, right, growing food, like mothering 1,000 children and a husband is not simple or easy. But a few weeks ago, Turning Point USA had their, their like conference, and they for the first time had a young women's leadership summit. And this is like what put all of this, kind of pulled it all together for me, is reading about this. But they had this speaker, Alex Clark, I think her name is. Her goal is to make American women thin, fertile, and conservative, which really all I hear you saying is white. Like, that's
Capital
it.
H.
That's it. That's all. I had to buy a dress this weekend and I was not fitting in the dress. And someone said, they're like, oh, well, this isn't really made for your body type. And I'm like, but like the point being, like, and I know I've said this many times, once you understand that you will never fit into these boxes because these boxes are more about whiteness than anything else, that plus this Sydney Sweeney Good Genes, this American Eagle advert, whatever you want to call it, propaganda, Good Genes automatically imply that there are bad genes. It's so triggering and it's so offensive. And it's also like, I don't know what we're supposed to do with this, but the fact that so much of this is presented as Christianity, nowhere in the Bible does it say that you should have blonde hair and blue eyes. Like, it does, like, none of these things, this isn't real. And I'm not trying to trash people's culture, like, have your culture, like, live your white life. Like, I'm not saying that that's bad. It's that, like, the belief that that is normal or that that is good or that that is this, like, black and white thinking. It's just like, it's damaging if you are not in it.
I think that's what I'm saying. I'm like, they're really close to something. Like in the article about the Turning Point Leadership Conference, they are like, we're not saying that there's a right and wrong thing, but we're saying that this message to women that you can have it all was a lie, which it was. It was. It is like, you actually, like, it is not sustainable to work full time and try to be a good wife in the way that society tells you you need to be and be a good enough mother. There's a quote in the article that is like, we just want women to understand the different paths and choose which one is right for them. And I was like, you are like really, really close to something.
That's feminism.
That is feminism? Yeah. I was like,
it's that you get to pick. It's that you have a choice. It's that you're not pigeonholed and told by society what you have to be.
The idea that we can exist in the system that exists right now and exist in the gender roles that have been laid out and quote unquote have it all is a lie. So that is the thing. It's like, it is feminism to be like, you actually can't have it all. These are the different lives you can choose. But then again, there's no subsidies. So it actually is not.
Exactly. Do you really have a choice?
It's not actually a choice
Right.
for
It's
women
not
to
an
stay home.
option.
Not a choice. And that's like the admittance that you cannot have the type of 1950s life without unpaid labor. And like right now, they'll say like, we don't need black and brown women to do it. Okay, fine. But then who do you think is doing it? It's the white women are doing it. Like, it's all unpaid labor. Like, our society can't run without some form of slavery.
Domestic, slavery or domestic labor, right? So unpaid labor. The rise even of the trad wives movement within the social, I was about to say social justice. That's not what it is. In this,
Absolutely not.
what is it called? I'm losing my words. I'm like all of these networks in which we connect and put our lives
Social
on.
media.
Thank you. But the rise of this is like a social media phenomenon is an economic phenomenon. It is a way that women have found to monetize their ability to stay home and raise their kids and take care of the domestic labor. They are monetizing their domestic labor. The problem is then they are selling that as if it's something that anybody could do. And the reality of the economic system is you can't actually do that unless you also find some way to monetize your ability to stay home by raising other people's children, by starting a daycare, by doing other people's laundry, by doing like the only way you get to stay home and raise your kids without subsidies is by turning your domestic labor into other people's, like carrying other people's domestic labor. or creating a media phenomenon in which people pay to watch your fantasy or their fantasy play out. And those women are working.
And not just people pay. To be clear, there are churches and conservative
think tanks and nonprofits,
who pay these women so much money to push this propaganda. Like, the reason that they're able to make millions of dollars is not just because, you know, if they have millions of followers, but it's also because like conservative white men are giving them a lot of money to sell this idea. And like, why is that? Because those are the people that benefit the most from having women stay home to do their unpaid labor.
I think it's also important to like remember that like the person society has identified as pushing this women can have it all perspective, like is credited to Sheryl Sandberg, like the COO of Facebook, like someone who was incredibly wealthy. And so the idea that she could have it all is because she had the money to hire outside help. And so like, even as we sort of think about where this is possible, it's either heavily subsidized by the government, a rich husband, or you yourself are independently wealthy or are wealthy because of your job to be able to pay for the things that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. So like the idea that anyone could do this was a bad idea because people do not have the resources to be able to do that. And I think the other thing that I wanted to sort of touch on is one of the things that has been really helpful to me in sort of the growth of sort of pushing against rigid gender constructs is understanding that gender is performance. And I think one of the ways that I was thinking earlier, because I think Dr. Carter mentioned something that hinted is like marriage as performance. That it is a way to sort of expand how we view marriage when we think about it as not as a rigid thing, but a more fluid structure, where in the same way that gender is performative, it sort of it performs something to society to help you sort of identify where you belong or where you sort of fit on the spectrum. I'm wondering if thinking about marriage, because it's how tradwives are thinking about it, marriage as performance. They are performing these acts of traditional stay-at-home, milking cows, whatever it is. But it's not. It's how they're sort of trying to place themselves on the spectrum of society. But I'm wondering if like thinking about marriage less as a traditional structure and more as how we perform our relationship might help people soften their idea of marriage. And by soften, I mean expand their idea of marriage.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get to this at the end, but I'll just, as a teaser, I think of marriage as a spiritual practice. And I think what Farley is talking about with respect to marriage as a way to demonstrate a kind of relationality that models the relationship we ought to be having with God. That's what they're talking about. And so anyway, I mean, I think there are lots of reasons
Dr.
why.
Carter,
Go
can
ahead.
you say more about what you mean by that when you say it models the relationality we ought to have with God? Because what I hear often is I struggle with this language that the church is the bride of Christ, because to me that always in our patriarchal society means the church is subservient to Christ and lives to serve Christ. And that even though Paul talks about in the epistles that marriage is supposed to be mutual servanthood, I don't know that our relationship with God is mutual servanthood. So that's why I always struggle with this idea of like marriage is this model of our relationship with God, because like in my relationship with God, like God is greater. I am not God. I serve God and God loves me. But God is not subservient to me, and I don't necessarily want God to be subservient to me, but I don't want to be subservient to my husband.
That's really interesting. And I think this is where I'm excited to have this part of the conversation, because I do think I don't think of myself as actually serving God. I think my relationship with God is one of vulnerability and relationality. And my commitment to do the work that I'm called to do is out of the love that I feel. It's reciprocity, actually. I would say more than anything else. It is reciprocity. There's a way in which I have experienced God do profound things in my life. And because I've had these experiences, I have been and felt compelled to give people the tools they need to open themselves up to have those experiences as well, but also to model that give and take. And Blair, again, I think you actually gave me the language for this months ago when we talked about love is never coercive, love is always relational. And I don't feel like God has ever, I've never felt coerced. I felt a longing that I've tried to fulfill. And so it's never been about service, much been about, it's like, this is what I want to do because of what has been done for me and through me. And that for me has just been, it's changed everything. I honestly think it's changed everything for me. And so when I'm talking about traditional marriage, or when I'm talking about God and loving God and what that looks like, it is through that lens of relationality and vulnerability and the ways in which these things, I believe, really reflect love at its core. They really reflect what love ought to be and what love is at its core. And I think we get too much, we can easily get stuck in the service aspects of it. When I don't think God asks us to serve God, I think God asks us to love God. And I think when you genuinely love God, I feel as though you can't help but love others. And the way that love gets manifest is in relationship. So yeah, sorry, I'm like, yeah, Blair asked me a question about gave me start crying, man, because I'm, it's just that it's that deep for me. It's that deep. Julia.
I was gonna say, I also think of, I mean, Les Miserables, to love another person is to see the face of God. I
Yes.
oftentimes spend a lot of time thinking about different types of relationships and different ways. To me, the purpose of the difference between like a best friendship and a romantic relationship is simply a different way of being able to experience giving and receiving love. Like just each relationship is so different. And I had not considered what scripture or Jesus says about marriage and relationships in marriage. But if it's true that it says nothing about love in marriage, I mean, like you said earlier, Chris, it doesn't say anything about it. I like that because I actually am one of the few people who believes that your primary relationship is not more important than any of your other relationships. Like when you get married, it's like, well, this is my primary relationship. And so it is more important. And I love this person more. I just don't, that's not how I see relationships. I don't see them as hierarchical or like some having more value. Some might have different responsibilities. And I think that that's important to acknowledge. But the idea of like, well, I love this person more, I think is not all, to me, wouldn't be the point.
No, I think that makes sense. And I think it's a good time for us to actually shift and transition into talking about a progressive vision of what marriage can look like with respect to the institution of marriage, but also gender roles as well. I do think when we're talking about marriage, it's some of the things we have to disentangle, and I should have said this in the beginning of the podcast. We're talking about Christian perspectives of marriage. I do think one of the challenges and the mistakes that Christians make is we try to legalize our theology of marriage, right? Like this is a problem. Like we're talking about even with should gay marriage be legal? I'm like, well, that has nothing to do. Like, like that's like marriage as a political institution is a legal contract, which is what I was saying has always been. It's been about justice and the legality of who owes what debts when someone passes away. It's much more about the kind of legal political framework. The religious framework is something different, and I think that is where we can have a conversation. The challenge and I think the reason that Christianity, one might say, has a negative reputation, and Wesley pointed this out last week, is trying to legalize our moral claims, right? When they are specifically our moral claims and should not be imposed upon other folk, right? In that kind of way. Blair, I know I toss it to you.
Yeah, and just as we reflect on this idea that there isn't scripture that talks about love between a married couple, I think that's actually true. I mean, I would need to do a full audit, but like the scriptures that we tend to read at weddings, love is patient, love is kind. What are the best of these things? Faith, hope, and love. A 3-cord strand is not easily broken. Like all of these things that we read are not descriptions of love between one man and one woman in a covenant of marriage. And then the things that are in the Bible, they're just about the community. They're like about how Christians should love one another no matter what. Whatever kind of covenant relationship you have, this is how we ought to love one another. It's not about sex and marriage. But then when we do have some scriptures about sort of affection and sex, that kind of like erotic love, it mostly comes from the Song of Solomon, which is about two unmarried young people. They're in love and they're sensual together, but they are not married and they are not betrothed. And so I think actually you've made a really strong point that we have conflated the love that Christians ought to have with all people as reserved for the marriage covenant. And that is not necessarily biblical.
Well, I was going to say that also. I was going to say, Julia, correct me if this is not the direction that you were trying to go. But I think that what Blair just said also speaks to the fact that Christians are called to be in like a more of a village community and experience love in a really communal way and in a really expansive way. And this idea that we're all supposed to find one person, and then that is the person that is the one most important thing. I think there's something to be said for that, but also sometimes that vision limits the ways that we experience abundance of community and even like friendship and other extended family relations, which kind of reminds me of what we said at the beginning about marriage being not only about the two people but about the whole unit that you are becoming a part of. So I think that's interesting, as like a progressive view of marriage also allows for a wider and more expansive idea of love.
That's exactly, I mean, you know me. So that is how I view it. One of the most difficult things I've had to reckon with in the last like 5 or 6 years is that a lot of my closest girlfriends, like divine feminine relationships, like my sisters, right? Sisterhood, have partnered with people who don't believe in divine sisterhood and then are required to serve their husbands and thusly neglect me and my relationship with them. I think marriage is sacred, which is why I don't think any of us should be getting a marriage license from any government. I think that we should be getting civil union, like it should be civil and it should be about union.
Agreed.
And it shouldn't have anything to do with whether or not two people are in love, whether they are queer, whether they are. I know two women in Tennessee who are co-parenting a child together and they are not romantically partnered, but they are partnered and they cannot do it. They cannot raise their child the way that they should be able to because they're not married and there is no other option for them. And I think that limitation is oppressive and is harmful for all of society and for all of us. So my idea of like a progressive marriage is like wedding is for the church. Like what we do civilly should be handled separately. But what do I know?
No, I mean, I think that is exactly in alignment. And again, just for y'all to have peek behind the curtain, like we didn't talk about our progressive visions ahead of time, and so I completely agree, and I gesture towards it by talking about like the politics of morality. And I mean, this is just what I come to believe. Like not having been married for so long, and also realizing the insurance, the way taxes, all these things are deeply political, and you need a contract that says we share in this stuff. You know, like that's what you need. It's a contract. That's basically what it is. That has nothing to do with like the moral sacredness I think about marriage. That's for the church. But I do need a contract, you know, with whoever, you know, we my wife and I own a house, like that we own that house, right? So we mutually liable, you know what I'm saying? And there's reasons you need to have that mutual liability, you know? Like, cause hey man, if somebody leave, like, you know, there's stuff they got to get paid for. That's separate from the actual theological implications of marriage. Before I say what I want to say about marriage, I know Wesley, Blair, Everest, is there anything you want to say more about your progressive thinking around what marriage could look like or ought be?
No particular thoughts. I mean, I don't know how, mostly because I don't think about marriage as something. It's just like, yeah, it's a thing that exists and people do it. And I've officiated so many weddings, so I understand all of it. I don't have any particular feelings as to like the structures of what a progressive marriage should look like or what it shouldn't look like. No real marriage thoughts in my brain across the board. Sorry.
No.
I want to speak before Blair because Blair actually is married, so I want you to have the final mic drop. Well, you know me. I'm like, if we can't change the systemic things that are causing the problem, what can we do on an interpersonal level? And so I've been thinking a lot about like the homes that people build as teammates and kind of like what does it mean to find a partner who makes your world bigger and like really is willing to share with you. And I think especially, I think sometimes even in queer relationships, heteronormativity sneaks in and gender roles sneak in funny ways. But in a lot of ways, like witnessing queer love and queer partnership and queer marriage, as I see that among more people in my community, has made me like think more and more about all of the women in straight relationships that I know that are in this situation where they're carrying way too much and have husbands that they really love who like that they are parenting and are like, I don't know. So I've been thinking a lot about the teammate aspect and the real, I guess it does feel like a spiritual practice of sharing everything and like really allowing each other the space to rest and the space to hold everything together, which that is not like a groundbreaking idea, but I think it's something that is really hard to practice in a world that has like taught so many women that their job is to hold the house all on their own.
I've so many thoughts. Like I could have a whole other podcast on what I think a progressive view of marriage is, because I love the idea that you can find a person who is spiritually, intellectually, socially, economically, and sexually fulfilling as your primary partner in life. That is a beautiful vision. I am very lucky that I have found a person who generally fulfills all of those things. But I am also a person who has had deep covenantal relationships with other people that didn't have all of those things, where we didn't live together and we weren't sexually involved, right? Like, and I am also lucky to be partnered to a person who has learned to understand that as a part of my spiritual life, is that I have a primary covenant with my husband, but I am going to be in spiritual, covenantal, mutually beneficial relationships with other people. And my family is not restricted by those who have birthed me or whom I have birthed. My family is not restricted to those that I have legal contract relationships with. And we are able to operate in a household where our family and our relationships are bigger. It's not a nuclear family. And we also struggle to maintain this healthy covenant that we have committed to one another for it to be lifelong, because life changes. People change. There's growth, there's pain, there's harm, there's recovery. And like the only reason that I've been able to commit to a lifelong marriage is because I believe in a God of grace who stays with me when I make mistakes and walks with me when I want to grow. And I have found in my partner a person who expresses that kind of unwavering, steadfast love to me. The reason I have chosen to be married is because I have found someone who treats me the way that God treats me and loves me the way that God loves me. And I try to do the same. And we're not perfect at it, and we make mistakes and we've had bumps, but like the only way we can make this impossible promise to each other is because God modeled it and God has promised to be part of it. So I do believe that marriage is a very, very spiritual, but I also understand that's not for everybody. And so I am not going to say that you have to go out and find a marriage like mine. Like I struggled for a while with polyamory in the queer community. And I was like, I don't understand it. I don't understand it. How can you make a covenant like that? And as I've grown in my marriage and been married longer and longer, I'm like, I can't do it. I can't have this depth of covenant and mutual love and refusal to control, but like deep desire and commitment to be with. I can't do that with more than one person at the level that I do it with my husband. But maybe other people can. And so it's not my job to tell you the number of covenants and the number of relationships, whether they be spiritual, sexual, economic, whatever, right? Like I don't get to decide that for you. That's between you and your partners and God. But that was a growing edge for me. And I had to understand that just because I am not built that way, that's not my capacity, doesn't mean I get to decide that for other people. So that's like, I guess, like a little glimmer of how I've started to understand this. And I'm still trying to understand it. I haven't even been married a decade yet. Ask me 20 years from now, I'll probably have more to say. I'm in a very egalitarian, very progressive marriage that is between that looks incredibly Christian and incredibly traditional.
So thank you, and thank you all for sharing. I mean, I think I'm glad we had this episode because I do think this is one of the spaces where there's this what we really are talking about progressive marriage really is a fundamental reorientation around the values that we have for each other as human beings, as autonomous individuals who are willingly, as in a free choice in a relationship and don't feel coerced, and also recognizes that the divine humanity, right, in each other. And because of that love and because of that humanity, there is some reciprocal love that takes place that transforms people. For me, fundamentally, those are like the non-negotiables. So I've been married for 22 years. I got married, super young. And we have had our challenges. One really, really difficult challenge while I was doing my PhD, which is pretty typical. And I think that what I have also grown to learn, and I think this is where I want to kind of go back to the models we do have in the Bible, is that at our best, I believe our marriage was in a particular place that allowed us to be in relationship with each other while we were in deeply transformative relationships with others in community. And so for me, when I know, I think some of you, not all of you, I think Julie, you got to meet my nephew when I call my nephew RJ. I first met RJ when he was 4 because his parents moved to campus, and I was the campus housing director. Because at one point in my life, I used to be super handy, and I was in charge of like fixing things in my graduate school housing. And between RJ's family, between Raphael and Vanessa living around the corner from me in the apartment building, and my best friend Seth and his wife Emily living around the corner from me, we had this village that was reminiscent of what you see in the Book of Longings. We had this village mentality where we did everything together. I was so happy. And I know what's the expression is, I wish you knew the good times. I can't remember the expression, what it is about the good times and you not know they're good until they're gone or whatever the heck. That's honestly what I felt like. And it wasn't until we moved to San Diego and I have all the dreams I'm supposed to have. I got a tenure track job. I got a book contract. I'm winning these awards. I'm getting invited to go to the Vatican and crap. You know what I mean? It's amazing, but I'm not nearly as happy as I was when I was a poor graduate student. And I'm like, oh, wow. I actually want to live in what people might call a commune. I was like, this actually is the model that the Bible gives us. It gives us what love looks like. When it talks about love in relationship and community, it's talking about love, right? As such, not just marriage, but love. And I think the notion of individualism that comes out of European context, especially, but particularly a particular kind of capitalistic context, that has infiltrated Christianity such that we believe in this kind of individualistic notion of marriage that is between a man and a wife, and that's it. That's not the vision we see in the biblical text. I would argue, going back to a more biblical version of family and community and marriage as a covenant between two partners, but within a broader covenant of family, would allow people to have the kind of lives, Everest, that you were discussing, where people don't feel like they're exhausted to do stuff. Right? Like my grandmother, I talked about her dying. She died young because she had her second stroke. But I remember when she died, I remember thinking this is going to be so much harder for Gabby and I when we have a kid. Because that's because if my grandma was alive, she would live here. Like, I have no doubt in my mind. She'd be like, well, you got to get, that's where she would be, because that's how she was. For me, a progressive vision gets back to more of those roots, right? And I would argue the ability to do that can get us out of some of this capitalistic framework, and get us out of some of the things that have weighed us down, right? And do it on a more individual, communal level. And so that's what I would like to see us go back to. And this is a tension that my wife and I have. We come from very different backgrounds when it comes to these kinds of things, and we're still growing towards that. And part of the reason we've stayed here, by here I mean Los Angeles, is because we've been able to create, like a little bit of community. Like Isaiah calls all of y'all aunt and uncle, right? Like that is meaningful to us. Like we have something we haven't had in a long time, and that really, really matters to me. And so I'm trying to do my best to maintain that. So anyway, this was an amazing episode. We were going to talk about some Jesus Christ Superstar, but now we know we don't have time because we've already gone over. So we're going to do, you all get a bonus mini-sode where they can talk about the amazingness that was that. And also, we are, again, grateful for the comments and the engagement that's happening on social media, on YouTube. So thank you again to those people who are doing that. I think still somewhat amazed, that like there are clearly people who want to be in conversation with folks like us that maybe don't have the capacity to. And I'm grateful for each of you for being able to participate in the creation of this podcast and the work that we do. So I want to thank you all for joining us for the Progressive Christians Podcast. The Progressive Christians Podcast is a ministry of The Loft, a worship community of Westwood United Methodist Church. If you'd like to connect with us and be a part of the conversation, you can find us on all social media platforms at The Progressive Christians. We're also grateful to our amazing audio engineer, AJ, who edits and mixes our show. Again, please rate, review, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. To us. If you, we didn't get any comments yet. I know I mentioned we have people from Norway and Hong Kong and all that stuff. If you are one of those listeners, please leave a Spotify comment, leave a iTunes.
We want to hear from you.
Email us.
Yeah, let me know. Like, I'm one of those people. That would be awesome. So anyway, thank y'all for listening. We'll see y'all next time. Bye.
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 Bye.